Hello, everyone. Thank you for your interest in our MHTTC School Mental Health Curriculum Always and Now Learning Series. We're going to begin. A reminder that all attendees are muted and today's session is being recorded. In the meantime, we have a slide on the screen to help you get comfortable with the Zoom webinar interface. Please utilize the chat box for questions and requests for help regarding audio and technical issues. Please make your comments to panelists and attendees, and be aware that all comments in the chat are open to public viewing. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. We will try and get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A period. Closed caption is also available for those who would like to enable or disable it. Click on the closed caption icon on the bottom of the Zoom platform and select the arrows for options to display and or hide captions. Repeat, for those of you who have not joined us, if you have entered the room, we thank you for being with us here today. We will get started. My name is PJ Wanger. I am the Senior Training and Consultation Specialist, School Mental Health Lead with the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'm excited to moderate today's session. Thank you for joining us for session 3 of our 8-part learning series, Mental Health Technology Transfer Center School Mental Health Curriculum Always and Now. A couple housekeeping items before we begin. We're going to be launching a quick poll for all participants momentarily. We really want to learn more about our audience, so please complete the poll as I share a few housekeeping items with you. As we are all adjusting to working from home, I am sure that many of you have become very comfortable with the Zoom video meetings. In any case, I want to share with you a few reminders regarding the technology logistics of today's meeting. To ensure the best audio quality for the duration of this meeting, we have muted mics and for all participants except for the speakers. If you have audio or technical issues during this session, the chat box is open for you to communicate with our team so they can assist you. If you have a link to resources and you'd like to share with other attendees or questions for the presenters, please enter those in the question and answer pod. We have team members monitoring the Q&A pod, and they will ensure the facilitators receive your questions. To open the Q&A pod, just hover your cursor over the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your window and click on the Q&A function. We have scheduled ample time for Q&A with our guests toward the end of the meeting, but please feel free to enter your question at any time. We've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If need be that we end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. You will receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance. The session recording and slide deck will be posted on our website within a few days. A reminder that captions are available for today's session. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. So again, welcome. If you are new to us, this 8-part series is a collaborative effort of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Centers, also known as the MHTTCs. We are a network funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a networking coordinating office. Our collaborative network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development for the mental health field. After today's session, we suggest you visit our website and find your regional center to keep in touch with us for more resources and training opportunities. A really quick disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this learning session are the views of our moderator and panelists and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Mental Health and Human Services. As part of receiving SAMHSA funding, we are required to submit data related to the quality of this event. At the end of today's training, we ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's session. The survey should automatically pop up on your browser window upon closing today's webinar. A quick reminder, as part of this learning series, we are hosting regional breakout sessions. These breakout sessions are intended to provide an opportunity for you, our participants, to ask questions about the content we'll cover today, and time to discuss and apply today's learning in an informal, moderated discussion with our staff, contextualized for your specific region, and including people from your particular region. The breakout sessions commence immediately following today's webinar. To participate in the 30-minute breakout discussion for your region, we will provide you access at the end of this webinar, so stay tuned. Okay, thank you for your attention during that quick introduction. I think we can get started now. So as many of you know, this 8-part training series uses the National School Mental Health Curriculum, guidance, and best practices for states, districts, and schools. The curriculum was developed by our network in partnership with the National Center for School Mental Health in 2019. It is intended to help states, districts, and schools advance comprehensive school mental health and engage in a planning process for implementation, and includes a trainer and participant manual, 8 set of slide decks for each module representing the core features of comprehensive school mental health, and additional resources. Today's live session will consist of a discussion with a small panel of education and mental health leaders who will provide an always and now application of the curriculum. We want to let it be known that the National School Mental Health Curriculum is a great resource to utilize in normal school settings, but also in this current context with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on provision of school mental health services. So our panelists will share with us their experience using the curriculum and innovative ideas for implementation in the current context. So let's pause a minute and look at the results of our poll. So we can see that about half of us did view the video of the Module 3 Needs Assessment and Resources prior to joining us. And also that we see that there are a good range of people who are familiar with the school mental health needs and assessment and resource mapping, and some who are unfamiliar. So our session today should be very informative for those of you who are new to this. So to start our session today, we are excited to have Dr. Chris Scardamalia providing a recap of the module and serving as one of our panelists for the second part of the session. Dr. Scardamalia is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland of Medicine, National Center for School Mental Health. She has extensive experience working with high-need youths and their families as a school psychologist in both the public schools and juvenile services. Her research focuses on the intersection of the education, juvenile justice, and mental health systems, such as investigating district-wide strategies to reduce exclusionary discipline practices. In addition, she provides training and technical assistance to states and school districts on developing and improving comprehensive school mental health. She leads the National Council of School Mental Health Training and Technical Assistant efforts related to staff well-being and cultural responsiveness and equity. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Scardamalia. I pass it off to you now.
Hi, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about this curriculum. As mentioned, this is going to be a brief overview. So if you had the opportunity to watch the module ahead of time, this will hopefully just hit the high points, spark some memory. And if you didn't have an opportunity, then I hope this engages your curiosity and makes you want to learn more about it. So what we're talking about today is needs assessment and resource mapping. So let's look at needs assessment first. What is that? Right, so a needs assessment is simply taking a snapshot of your system and understanding where your needs are. Seems fairly straightforward, but some of the things that get in the way of this, or reasons why we might need to engage in this, is if we haven't really systematically taken a look at what we have. It's easy to go years and for things to evolve and all of a sudden realize we're not meeting the needs that we thought we were. And there may also be pockets or groups within our district or within our schools whose needs are not being met in a way that might surprise us. So we want to gather all of this information. What are our strengths and what do we have? What are the needs of our group, right? This is going to help us clarify our priorities. Where do we need to spend our time and money? I have yet to talk to a school district or state who's like, well, actually, we just sort of have an abundance of time and money, and we don't really need to prioritize, right? If I've only got a little bit, where do I put it? Maybe I have some services, but they need to be improved. And that's going to come out in a needs assessment. And then some advanced action planning, right? So we've got some basic stuff going on. We want to go to the next level. What would that look like? So you'll see on the following slide here, right? Why do this? So helps identify and address what mental health needs are most pressing. I think this year, this question has a slightly different flavor to it, right? As we go year to year, we generally have a sense of what needs are, but with the disruption in COVID over the past school year and entering into next school year, this is a pretty pressing question on a lot of folks' minds. What are the needs? What are the expectations that we should have for staff and students returning to our buildings if they've been mostly virtual? Understanding are our existing services meeting needs? How can we leverage our strengths? And what do our priorities currently look like? And is that actually meeting where our populations are right now? So a companion to needs assessment is this resource mapping process, right? So a needs assessment is going to tell us what are the current needs out there? Are we meeting them? And we can go to the next slide for that one. There we go. Right. What resource mapping is going to tell us is how do we meet those needs? Do we have what we need to get there? So resource mapping is a process of identifying, visually representing, and sharing information. So you can actually create a literal virtual resource map. And this really helps us visualize what is out there. The reason why this is important, the value of these resource maps, is it really helps us to start to see those gaps and potentially duplications, right? Are there local resources that we're missing that are available to us that we're not engaging in? Maybe it's simply a matter of we need to improve awareness, we need to improve access. And this whole process of just reaching out, finding out what are the resources that are out there, what are we tapping into, what are we not tapping into, gives you a lot of opportunity to communicate, collaborate with groups in your community that maybe you haven't engaged in this kind of structured conversation before. Sometimes this can even happen within a school district, right? Departments that are, everybody's running fast and furious, doing their thing, and two departments haven't really talked to each other yet. This comes up sometimes when we talk about the research and evaluation section in school districts, or even HR or business management, that there's issues that HR is aware of and ways that things need to be done, or that our business office knows, and we're not regularly communicating with them. So this is going to help bring everything together into one sort of clear package. Right, and on this next slide, we see how do these fit together, right? In a very simple way. Needs assessment tells us what do we need to develop, what's working well, and resource mapping tells us how we actually meet that need, and do we have what we need to do that. When we think about this process of needs assessment and resource mapping, we want some quality indicators, right? What tells us that we're doing a good job with this, that we're on target with this? So this list here, and we'll go through each one briefly, but this gives you a sense of what should I be watching for to gauge, is this quality, or do I need to do something a little different with it? So the first area is assessing student mental health needs. Again, I think in our current context, this might be the #1 question on everybody's mind. What do my students need right now? So best practices around this, and we can go to that next slide, is when you're assessing needs, you really want a diverse needs assessment team. We want to be thinking broadly and deeply, right? So a lot of times we'll send out surveys and the same folks return our surveys. And when we really start looking at who's informing our processes, it may be a particular group in school or a portion of our schools, students, families, teachers, but maybe not everybody. So are we doing a comprehensive look? What data do we already have? What data is existing that can be looked at that we're not utilizing right now? We don't need to reinvent the wheel if we've got that data sitting out there somewhere. Making sure that we're using sound processes and tools. And with nearly everything that we talk about implementing, you want to start small, right? So pilot your needs assessment first so that we can get a sense of, did this process work? Logistically, is this going to work? Did it give us the data and the feedback that we thought it was going to give us? We want to start small, make sure that that process is good, that we're getting the information we need, and then we can scale up. A companion to this is not just thinking about student needs, but what are our students' strengths? We know that protective factors are incredibly important when it comes to mental growth and well-being. There are some reasons why districts may be concerned about engaging in needs assessment, or that just might not feel like a good place to start. Starting with strengths is a great way to go. What are the strengths that we can leverage that our current students have, that our students currently have? So you see a lot of the same considerations here, right? Reviewing what data do you have, what data is there and we haven't thought to look at before, making sure that your processes are psychometrically sound, culturally relevant, right? It's really, really important to think about the assessment that I have that I want to use. Is this culturally relevant for my students and for my community? It might be an absolute rock star tool, but it just doesn't really align well with your community. Again, piloting before we go wide, and then determining how current supports and services can be leveraged to address these gaps in student strengths. Here's a lot of research, a growing amount of research that says bolstering student strengths is every bit as important as addressing student needs. All right, so what's our next indicator? Did you use your needs assessment? This is a kind of pretty straightforward, right? We put all of this time and effort into conducting this needs assessment. Did we actually use it to inform our decisions? I don't know about you guys, but I've seen this disconnect before, right? One group is doing this process and collecting this information, and another group is deciding how to implement. And when you really align the two, you're like, oh, one's not really feeding the other. We want to make sure that this process that we're doing informs the decisions we make. And this can help not just with big decisions, but prioritizing within some of these areas. All right, and then next, there we go. To what extent did our district or school conduct resource mapping or have access to an updated resource map? One of the things that I would advise here is do your resource mapping in a way that it can be continuously updated. This can take a lot of time when you're doing it from scratch, and it can feel a little bit like an overwhelming ask. But once you get the process down, it works well. You don't want to have to go redo all of that every couple of years to get updated sense of what's going on. So however you decide to do this, whether it's an existing team and a live Google Doc, something that you can do that is routinely and on some sort of regular schedule updated, so we can figure out maybe there's resources that just aren't there anymore. There may be community mental health centers that we were coordinating with and they have changed or no longer exist. So if you've got a continuous update, it really helps those future years not have to undertake the same amount of process, right? All right, and yeah, so they were regular establishing. One of the examples that we have here is a Midwestern high school, somewhat large, 1,700 kids, right? And they do this resource mapping process. And what they found is that there were a lot of supports available in the school, but students, families, and even staff were often unaware. Now, if you think about, you're looking at, excuse me, you're looking at services, you're looking at outcomes, and you may be thinking, we're doing all this tier 1 stuff, and I don't think this tier 1 programming is very good or is quality because I'm not seeing the outcomes I thought I was going to see. But if the issue is that your students, families, and staff don't know about those, then it's not the quality of the program. It's more getting the information out there, making sure people are aware of it, making sure people know how to access it, what the referral stream looks like. So this changed the way the school district or this high school is going to approach things. So they're no longer looking at redoing their tier 1 programming. They know they just need to open access to it or get the word out better than what they had. All right. Next best practice. This gets at just using that updated resource map to guide decisions, right? We want to be continuously updating, making sure we've got the best lay of the land out there, and identifying areas and needs that are not adequately addressed. This is another area where we want to make sure, big picture is important, broad picture is important. We also want to be looking closely to make sure that all groups within our district have adequate resources, that it's not just sort of like, yeah, we've got 70% of these students that are doing well and accessing things, but they're watching for those small groups, particularly groups that tend to be more marginalized in our schools. Did they have resources available to them and accessible to them? One note here about reducing or abandoning. This isn't something we often think about. We add a lot, right? It's like this cool new thing and that cool new thing. But how many times have you been in a school and you ask about a service or a resource? Like, so why that one? Why are we doing that? And it's like, because that's what we've always done. I don't know. It was just here when I got here, and it's just sort of the way we've always done things. So one thing that we recommend is don't be afraid to strategically abandon programs or resources that just aren't working for you anymore. Again, we want to be efficient with our time and our resources. We don't need to be putting those into areas if they're not ultimately helpful to us. All right, our next best practice is aligning those services and supports, right? So as you're mapping everything and you have this big picture, we really want to make sure that everything is covered and we don't have a lot of duplication going on. You know, there are times when we sit down and look, it's like, wow, actually 3 different agencies are offering the same exact resource, and the amount that's available actually exceeds what we know the need is for. We can diversify. Some folks can be doing other things, right? We don't have a lot of resource or time to waste, so we don't want to be duplicating services. And then finding those gaps, right? Where's the misalignment? Where are things not working well? And again, we want to be okay about reducing or abandoning our reliance on programs or resources that just aren't working for us anymore, or just aren't giving us the type of outcome, or maybe as much of an outcome as we would like to see. Developing a team-based process can be really an important point for sustainability. And we really think about where this knowledge is living. This is a very hard thing for one person to stay on top of, for one person to stay updated, for one person to really hold all that knowledge, even maybe 2 or 3 people. But a team-based process ensures a nice spread of folks who are putting time and energy into it. And it also means that if you have somebody who moves into a different position or leaves the district altogether, they don't take all of that knowledge with them. We have the rest of the teams like, no, we know where we were going. We know there's all those little informal conversations, and it helps with continuity. All right. That is really the very quick overview of needs assessment and resource mapping. Hopefully this sparked your curiosity if this is the first time that you're engaging in it, and you kind of see how this might really benefit your district, your school, your state, whatever level you're working at, to really think through, what do I want our school mental health resources to look like, and are we covering everybody who has a need out there? All right, thank you guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scardamalia. We appreciate you providing that lovely recap of our Module 3 of the School Mental Health Curriculum. And we're going to start our next portion of our session, which is our panel discussion. So we have with us today, Dr. Gray. Dr. Gray is a Choctaw Cherokee Research Associate Professor and Associate Director of Indigenous Programs at the Center for Rural Health at the University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences. We also have Dr. Romero, who is the CEO and owner of Junior Romero and Associates, a training and consulting company he started almost 21 years ago that focuses on behavioral health evaluation, consultation, and specialized training. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today. So let's get started. Let's start by having you both tell us a little bit more about yourself, your role, and how school mental health needs assessment and resource mapping plays out in your work.
Thank you, PJ. This is Jackie Gray. And for me, I started working, gosh, over 30 years ago with schools. And a lot of that was getting to know what it was that they needed. And there were variations from one school to another. I worked with 23 rural school districts. So there wasn't just a one size fits all for those. There were lots of different resources that were and were not available in each one. And so helping to identify what was available for each site and where they could access the resources they need was a big part of that.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. Dr. Romero?
Yes, thank you, PJ, and thank you, Dr. Gray, for those experiences. We also, from my perspective, have some experiences that lend itself to. I usually joke that I started working with teens when I was a teen, so right out of high school, 1920, as a camp counselor, and I've seen those needs grow over time. So I really felt that from my role as an intern, actually working within a school system, all the way to then overseeing community health programs through a school-based mental health center, has been my evolution over the last 20 plus years. And I really have seen uh, growth in the mental health areas in school systems. But as you can imagine, there's still pockets of rural communities and underserved communities that we'll get more into discussion today about in terms of how we address some of those needs. And some of my most recent experience with 26 different clinics scattered across northern New Mexico. So thank you to the MHTTC folks and all of our hosts today for welcoming us.
So we have some specific questions for you. Our first question is going to go to Dr. Gray. What are some of the positive outcomes and successful results that have come out of your effort through utilizing the needs assessment and resource mapping?
When I was working with the health department in Oklahoma, we did what we called wellness checks with students. We would go out and set up with the school. We'd go through this survey with them, and then having staff from the health department to go over the responses to that. But then the school would get a summary of those responses. And from that, I could work with the counselors and administration to do some planning of what are the target areas that they needed, like especially with middle school students, identifying early on where parents were going through a divorce and the kids were having a hard time, that they could get some groups going at the first of the school year, not wait until those students were identified late in the school year to get something going for them and really help process that.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. Our next question I'm going to address to Dr. Romero. What are some of the challenges that you have encountered around needs assessment and resource mapping? And what are your recommendations for overcoming these challenges?
Yes, thank you, PJ, for the question. I think a few things that I would know that I want to put a little bit of meat to the skeleton that we covered in terms of the needs assessment and community mapping module. I think one thing that we really have to be careful of as a pitfall is making decisions about diverse populations without those diverse populations being involved in the decision making. And I think with that said, we have to be very considerate, whether that's a student population, Latinx populations, people experiencing immigration, our indigenous communities, which in New Mexico, we're surrounded by 18 pueblos and a reservation with the Navajo Nation as well. And we have to be very considerate of those cultural appropriateness when it comes to involvement. And the second thing that I would say is that you always have to have a plan of having those individuals from those diverse populations that I mentioned be involved in any planning, be involved in any direction and feedback. And then secondly, I would say in order to alleviate any potential challenges is to always consider your dissemination. Never going into a community and taking from that community without having an appropriate protocol for how you're going to go back and disseminate the information that can better serve that community, whether you're going in as a higher education, a department or school or college, or a community-based agency. And then secondly, I would add one last piece is that any efforts always have to have a cultural appropriateness attached to it. And I think, for us at the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC, our basic cultural elements about respeto and about family and respect come in really, really uniquely. And I think align themselves really well with Module 3, and specifically when we kind of look at what are some of the challenges. The last thing that I would add in this is just accessibility and having a small team available, right? Especially when you're going into rural communities, it really does take a team to get this done. And I think identifying your team in advance of who can be champions of these needs assessment and community mapping is key in strategizing. Thank you.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Romero. Certainly things to consider when you're doing this work. This question goes out to both of you. What has been your experience in adapting your needs assessment and resource mapping strategies to diverse populations, and what considerations do we need to be aware of? And I know, Dr. Romero, you touched on that, but maybe you can expand on that with this question.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I would definitely insert here the need for, again, involving those individuals that you are attempting to help or support or identify needs that they may have, involve them in that process. And I think that's the number one appropriate and respectful and culturally respectful thing that you can do. I think secondly is really making sure that you have accessibility to get a good sample of information. Typically, we access groups of people that are affluent or more connected to schools, where we may be missing individuals that aren't connected, and that may be a great need that assessment really identifies for us, right? Is that there's a gap in communication, maybe providing access in the language of the the students and families that you're serving. And then the last thing that I would say is just including a strategy for how are you going to adapt the specific tools that you have to be culturally appropriate. And when I say that, as Christine mentioned, really adapting the tools, because instruments are typically designed with certain parameters and certain populations, right? When we look at certain instruments, so adapting those instruments and not being afraid to really adapt some of the questions that uses appropriate language. Looking at the class standards really helps. When we look at cultural linguistic standards, can really help guide and help schools in that effort.
Dr. Gray, would you like to comment on this question?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the things that Dr. Romero has said, working in rural and tribal communities. One thing that we know is, they're not alike. And with different cultures, different resources available to them and everything, you have to look at, as far as looking at what the resources are that you have, how you can make that work to meet the needs in your community. How can you get creative with that? And making sure that you're utilizing those cultural factors and those other supports with the rural youth. Maybe it's FFA and FHA, or maybe it's boys and girls clubs in the tribal communities and things like that. But you make use of all of those resources that may be available to you, even if they're on a more informal level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Gray and Dr. Romero. Our next question, again, goes out to both of you. What has changed in how needs assessment and resource mapping occur now because of the pandemic? And what have you had to adopt or change to learn to do it differently?
Dr. Gray, do you want to take that first?
I was going to let you, but I think our biggest thing is switching from face to working on Zoom and other video platforms. It's just not the same, where we might be able to go before and have a handshake or a hug, or really greet one another and share with one another in a very personal way. It's how do you do that across a video platform? And that's a real challenge that we've had through the pandemic. And I'll let you jump in, Dr. Romero.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. I would echo that. And I think that a couple of things come up with this when we were planning for this panel discussion is one, always recognizing accessibility. and accessibility on a number of levels, not only when we're talking about language access and having the appropriate documents and tools in the appropriate language. So if that takes time to work with someone who can translate those documents into appropriate language, I think that needs to be done. The other thing that we're seeing is really with bandwidth, right, and technology and the lack of access in some of our rural and indigenous communities where we may have to drive out to those communities more regularly now. I think the embracing of technology, which in some of the communities I've worked in, when we're talking about metropolitan areas and areas that are, affluent with technology in many respects, a lot of times we assume that means all of our communities are affluent and have access and know how to utilize technology, which we know is not the case. And even if we do have, or they do know how to use technology, sometimes it's accessibility of the platforms in order to use that technology. So I think one thing that I've heard from school personnel also now in a presentation I did last week is really how they've had to use platforms that students are more apt to using, like text messaging, like sending out messages through Instagram and Twitter and other social media platforms in order to get education and access opportunities out to smaller and more rural communities. And then I think the last thing that I'll say here is really researching and looking at other application or apps, platforms that you can utilize. We recently adopted one here in McKinley County in the really in the one of our most underserved socioeconomically areas of our state. We started to go to a choice recovery app that is able to help individuals track their progress through this app in terms of the groups that they attend. It even has a GPS coordinate so you can locate them in their community. So there's different ways now. And let me just say this, I always say we always have to be aware of the, what can I say this, ambivalence or skepticism or fear that some of our rural or indigenous communities may have or Latinx communities may have with using those platforms. So building trust and reassuring that that you'll be there to support them, I think is key in that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gray and Dr. Romero. And Dr. Romero, I would encourage you to put the name of that app in the chat box because I'm thinking that some people are going to be asking for that. Our final question to both of you, what are some recommendations you would make for schools and communities who are just starting out or who are utilizing the needs assessment and resource mapping best practices that are within the school mental health curriculum?
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Dr. Gray, if that's okay with you. So I think a couple of things here, and I really feel that starting with, some of I know a lot of the attendees maybe come from counseling, school social work, different sort of backgrounds of that nature. So really, when you look at the echo mapping process of developing strategies, it's very similar when we talk about community mapping. Right, we're now just kind of taking that to a systems approach. And I think with the cores of social work, and I'll speak from my frame of reference, being genuine and doing what you say and saying what you do and sort of this community building effort really helps build relationship and collaborative efforts. I think the other things that we've seen is really through a Paulo Freire pedagogy of the oppressed approach, where we really also seek experts from the community as able to teach us things rather than always going to higher ed or to sort of these governmental agencies. We have a lot to offer in our communities that we can then bring them in to really help with that relationship building at the initial stage. And I think building that healthy framework is important. I'll leave you with two references if that's okay, and then I'll put these in the chat room as well. One is Carol Kultau, and I hope I'm saying that right, but she has a process which is the search information process, which really is a process that helps you work through with a number of community agencies looking at short and long-term goals, and then through a group dynamic process, whittling those goals down to then help you develop a community mapping strategy. and adding in that kind of model really does help, I think, with when folks are a little lost in terms of what to do next kind of process. And then the second one that I used in my reference here for community mapping in action, uncovering resources and assets for young children and their families, is from JASIS and MIC. 2012, and I'll put this in the chat as well. But this one really looks and evolves, I think, the 3 tiers that Christine mentioned in the introduction, right? It really puts that into practice in my mind. And the last thing that I'll say about this is, don't be afraid to be creative and innovative. I think sometimes we tend to kind of do the same things over and over again. And I'm from old school, right? I've been around a little while now, but I still think that being innovative and creative on the basis of some of these models as our framework can really help us to gain a lot of success in our mapping and really needs assessment portion of school development. Dr. Gray, thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that you've mentioned, Dr. Romero. I've been working with the American Indian Alaska Native Technology Transfer Centers in developing resiliency teams in tribal communities. And with that, again, leaving it to each community. We're there to offer some help and guidance and feedback and help you to find resources to address some of those needs. But putting it on each community that make this resilience team what you need it to be. And that way it's different everywhere, but it's helping them to know that they can take these resources and apply them in so many different ways. And so they have to figure out what's the best way to apply it in their community and recognizing that flexibility.
Thank you, Dr. Gray and Dr. Romero also. And thank you, Dr. Scardamalia. We really appreciate you guys sharing your expertise with us today. We have several questions in the Q&A pod, and I want to be mindful of the time and try to get to as many questions as possible. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Amanda Ashalik from Great Lakes MHTTC, and she will lead the Q&A. Amanda?
Thanks, PJ. So we've been monitoring the questions and answers that you guys have been entering. And so we do want to take some time to get to some of those questions today. The first question that we have, I know Dr. Gray touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can expand that as well, is a question about some of our rural communities. It comes from Maria, wondering about how to navigate supportive service areas within limited access, when there's limited access to community resources, or they might have community resources, but they're the burnt out community mental health agencies. So when there's limited resources, what can schools do to help?
And that's always a struggle in our rural and remote areas. And one of the things that when I was working with the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, that developing, maybe whether it's video Zoom but linking different community mental health providers together to provide supports for one another can really help that lessen that feeling of being alone and burning out. And so trying to think again creatively on how you can get the supports that those providers and resources need in order to keep going and providing you with those wonderful resources as close to your community as you can get.
Dr. Gray. Dr. Romero, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll add to that. And I did see a couple of questions or requests for sources, so I did put those in the chat. But I think like Dr. Gray mentioned, I think it's really trying to establish again those relationships, but taking it a step further in terms of, I know some of the difficulty right now, especially in rural communities with COVID and some of the restrictions, is having to do a lot of our work via Zoom and other platforms. So I think being aware of that process being difficult, and us, especially when we talk about Indigenous and in my case, Latinx communities, we have to be able and willing to spend the time. And sometimes we, whether we're under grant pressures or deadlines for grant applications or whatever the case, I hope that we don't reflect that pressure onto our communities and feel like we have to rush them through that process, because I think that can be detrimental to the long-term success. I would also say that, really, we've worked through a collaborative effort and really we've built over the last, and so when I talk about time, this took us about 6 years to reestablish a behavioral health collaborative in our community that is looking at all continuums of care relative to Latinx communities, so adolescents as well as adults and our elders, obviously. And with that, it took us 6 years to build it, and it took a lot of collaboration, partnering on grants together, really establishing MOUs or MOAs so that everybody is clear in what you're doing and there's a commitment to that. And then now we've started to establish those through resolutions at our local county commission, city council meetings, and really establishing a partnership with not only Indigenous, Latinx, but also obviously our mainstream populations as well. And we've seen some success with that also.
Thank you both for your thoughts on that. It's very helpful. Our next question comes from Sarah, speaking of Zoom platforms. So what is the most effective way to conduct visual resource mapping with diverse groups of district stakeholders when done remotely? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can share just a little bit. Dr. Gray, if you don't mind me jumping in here. We have that example that I just shared. The Mora, San Miguel, and Guadalupe counties local collaborative is a behavioral health collaborative that was established actually several years ago under funding through legislative funding. And what we've done is we've had to hold a number of our meetings now over the last year, obviously over Zoom. So what we did is through our presentations and keeping people vested in that, we actually brought in different stakeholders to present on their different area in the community and continuum through presentations and bringing different resources that are available to the participants and their constituents in that sense. And we've done that through a number of different sub-working groups where through Zoom we created, and there's ways through Zoom that you can do breakout rooms, which is, I think, it really does fit with the information search process that I referenced, where you can do breakout rooms, and each room is tackling different portions of the needs assessment or of the mapping that you're doing. So what I always say is there's always a core group that's always really very active, but what I think is important is to engage other community members to be a part of these subgroups, that you can then task those subgroups with different tasks, and then you bring it back to the bigger collaborative. And through that sort of community learning, I would say it's a community learning platform in most cases, and sharing and dissemination of information has been key for us as well.
I think we found the first time that I set up a community team that, we invited all of the logical and apparent resources the first time. And then after that, we had all of these others like foster parents and Ministerial Alliance and other groups that came to us and said, we want to be included, that we hadn't thought about, but we're also community resources that we could bring in. And as they became more aware of what we were doing, we had more groups that wanted to be part of the solution within the community.
Thank you for your thoughts on, and that collaboration is so key. Let's see, a question from Alexandra, who is looking for, their district is very interested in district-wide social emotional learning programs next year. And there's so many to choose from, and many are cost prohibitive. Wondering if there's suggestions or recommendations that any of you all have for districts that are looking at some new curriculums to help support their school mental health programs.
Go ahead, Dr. Romero.
Yeah, I would say that, let me just be clear. I would say don't always look for the magic model, right? Or the one model that's just gonna kind of meet all of your needs, because a lot of times, and I would say 99% of the cases, if a model that you feel is successful for other communities, and you've seen that that community looks or feels or has similar beliefs as yours do or yours does, I would say to look at that in more depth, and then reach out to one of your mental health technology transfer centers. There's a lot of technical assistance opportunities that can help you to adapt that model that you feel is appropriate to be culturally relevant and appropriate, but to also consider your population. And as you pilot it, maybe, and that's what I would always suggest before you invest the money, the time and effort and kind of person power into a model. I would definitely suggest that you do some research, and that you also maybe consider piloting it for 30 days, 60 days, with whatever level of intervention or prevention effort you're looking at. But pilot it before you put all the time and effort and person power into a certain model. And then, like I said before, reach out to your local center in your region, and or us at the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center for Latino and Hispanics, and we can definitely help you adapt models that you would want to consider. Depending on what you are looking at doing, I think there's a number of different models that we could recommend. If it's suicide and suicide prevention, there's obviously models that we would look at specific to that. So I think that would be where I would just ask for more information. And I'll share my email with everybody in the chat. I'm more than willing to follow up with folks as they have further questions beyond this.
And I think a couple that are listed in the chat are Sources of Strength and Sanford Harmony as possible SEL programs.
If I can, I just want to jump in real quick. Absolutely everything both our panelists have said about this. And then when you're piloting, make sure you're getting feedback from the students that you're using it with. And make sure that when you're piloting, you're selecting groups of students that are diverse and representative of the whole student body. Because it's great if all the adults in the building think it's a great program and the website's vetted and it's all of that. But if it's not engaging with your students and your students aren't getting into it, it's just not going to be a good. It's not going to be a good fit. So make sure that end user, right, your students, maybe your parents, depending on the module or the model that you're using, that you're getting feedback from them also.